today. And at this point, Dr. Mertes, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to let everybody know that the slides will be available after the presentation?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing it up. So Dr. Mertes has made the slides available for our registrants. So afterwards, we will be sending that out to everybody. So thank you, Dr. Mertes.
Yeah, absolutely. That question always comes up, so I thought we'd just get it right at the beginning. As Daniel has so kindly said, I am a professor of rehabilitation counseling and mental health counseling in Montana. And I'm going to give a little background to how this presentation came up. For one, we have a lot of students here at our program, and I think this is kind of consistent across the country, that are wanting to start private practices of some kind. Most of the time, that means private practices in the mental health field. But in the rehabilitation counseling world, there's a ton of private practice opportunities. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit, more tailored towards those of us who do rehabilitation. And I have spent a bunch of my time, the last maybe 6 years-ish or so, in the private rehabilitation world. In fact, some of the names I see in the room here are familiar to me. Part of spending that time has been getting to know what kind of work people do in the rehabilitation world outside of state rehab. And so this presentation is mostly going to be tailored to those of us who are either transitioning from one kind of work to another and want to have more opportunities to maybe potentially provide services in your communities, or those who are just coming out of school. So one thing I want to point your attention to, though, is at the link at the bottom of this page. A few months ago, a lady named Molly Sullivan reached out to me from the Rehabilitation Service Administration and said, hey, can you put some content in your classes? Excuse me. Can you put some content in your classes related to helping VR counselors find self-employment for people with disabilities? And so I said, absolutely. And so this is kind of, some of the content here is from her and some of it is from my experience. And if you want to go check out that stuff, it's actually really good. Some trainings are not so good, and we all have been in trainings that don't work so well. But the students have told me that, hey, those are actually really great, and there's lots of good information in there too. So if you see something you like here, there's maybe more of it you can get there too. So there's just the abstract and the learning objectives. You guys have all seen those. If you're here, you've probably read what this is going to be about. So the first question I've answered a little bit already is, who could use this material? So it's people transitioning from one kind of work to the other, or people coming right out of school. When I started my career in rehab, one of the first things I wanted to know is, what can I do with it? And what are my options? And so this is kind of part of that discussion, is how do we provide additional services if there's some sort of need in a community that isn't being addressed or met? And so all of us have probably at some point or other been able to identify gaps in services, and there may be opportunities in different communities for us to provide those. But if there's not an employer willing to hire us or set up to hire us, then this is a place that we can maybe jump in and sort of set up our own business of some kind. So below that first bullet point or first question, we're going to go through the steps. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of business setups. Some of you here already have I can recognize some of the names. Some of you have set up businesses, and please jump in the chat if you hear something that I say that can provide additional clarification for others, or if I misspeak and say something wrong, feel free to clarify, because there's a lot of experience in the room here that can supplement what I'm sharing with you here. Most of this is going to be pretty basic. Because there's so many different directions people can go, I'm going to give you the basics of how to plan and set things up, but it might be a little bit different depending on your area of interest. For example, if you're going to set up a mental health practice to serve people with disabilities, or if you're going to work in the Social Security Administration providing expert testimony, those things are probably going to look slightly different. So I'm going to stick to the general stuff, and then we can get more specific with your interest, or later at a different time. So why set up a business? Why is this even something that we have to think about? I know that when I was in school, all I wanted to do was get a job, and I wanted someone to hire me because I didn't want to have to think about accounting and taxes and all those things. But as I got going, I realized that there were other kinds of work, and some of them would require me to sort of go out and pave a new path and seek those on my own. And I really wanted to know, what are all of my options? And so some of them required me to to think about myself as a business owner, and others were allowed me to think of somebody else can pay me to do this, or, you know, treat me as an employee. But I had to figure that out. So that's kind of the impetus for doing this. And a couple months ago, Daniel and I bumped into each other on another webinar, and he's like, hey, you should probably do that for us. And I said, okay, that sounds great. I'll do that. We'll talk about this stuff. So where do we even start? That's the next question. I think I've already talked about the first point here. Why start a business? And the short answer is to provide additional services to support people with disabilities that don't currently exist. Now, there are other reasons too, and we can certainly get into those if you'd like, but one of the most common ones that I hear from students is I want flexibility in my schedule. I want the ability to pay myself and not be capped at a certain salary. Or I need a certain accommodations, and I would rather just set up my business in the way that I need it so it works for me and my customers, clients, or whatever. So there's lots of different reasons why somebody might do this kind of thing. So let me go through a basic example of what I'm considering to be a business, just for demonstration purposes. I was going to ask for show of hands because I do that in classes, but I can't see your hands. But think of a lemonade stand. Most of us have either seen a lemonade stand or purchased something from one or had one of our own. If I take a lemonade stand and I walk my stand out to the corner of a street and I put it on the street and I put a pitcher of lemonade and a bunch of cups there, I'm setting up a business, essentially. And if somebody comes along and gives me $1 for 1 cup of lemonade, I'm going to use round numbers here because I know that's overcharging for a glass of lemonade, but just work with me here. Somebody comes along, gives me $1, I've just made a business transaction, and I am now technically a business owner. The question is, what do I do with that money? Because if I were to just do that all day long, and along comes a guy from the city or a lady from the city and says, hey, actually, you know, all of that income that you're making, you're supposed to pay taxes on that because you're kind of using a city sidewalk or, you know, the city street. And so we need to find a way to make a different arrangement to pay out taxes. And that's kind of an important part of being an employee or a business owner, is how we share the money around to the government and other people. So technically, I'm a business owner at that point. Now I'm going to pause that story or that analogy here for a second. And I want to answer this last question before we get into some more specifics about our lemonade stand example. Should everybody become a business owner? No, it's not going to be for everybody. The purpose of this presentation is just to give you some more information to help you decide, if I want to do this, how do I find out if it's right for me? I'm sure some of us have heard stories of people who have been employees who have said, you know what, I really want to be able to have a little more control over my income. So I'm going to go out and set up my own practice, and I'm going to go try that and see if it works. Other people have said, you know, this business owner stuff is a lot of work and it's a lot of responsibility, and I much prefer just getting a paycheck and not having to worry about taxes and you know, regulations and that kind of thing. So this is for information purposes, not to tell you the best direction for you. That's what career counselors can help with, and your professors and mentors and all that stuff. So let's talk about the different business structures and go back to our lemonade stand example for a second. If I take my $1 that I made from my lemonade stand and I pay out, let's just use a round number again, a dime. So 10 cents of my $1 goes out to pay taxes. The rest of that money goes into an account, like a bank account or something. And so I put it in my account, and let's say I have $100 in my account, and I put my $1 in and I add, and I say, oh, this is great. I'm making money and earning a living. And then somebody comes along and buys a glass of lemonade, and they take a big sip and they spit it out, and they're like, oh, there's too much sugar in this lemonade. I don't like this lemonade. I want my money back. And you were thinking, by the way, this is bad business practice. You don't want to do this. But if you say, I can't give you a refund because that lemonade is gone and I can't do that for you. And they say, okay, well, I'm going to sue you. Well, if they come after your business and they say, well, I'm going to sue you for my $1, but also for $50 of I don't know, emotional hardship or whatever, whatever they want to sue you for. They're going to take your, they're going to say, well, you put your $1 in your personal bank account, and I want that $50 back, but they're taking money that you earned somewhere else, not from your business. You've technically only earned $1 or $2 now on your business. And so they're not only suing the business, but they're suing you. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but the reason we have these different business structures that you see on the screen is because they help us just organize ourselves and how we're counting our money in different pockets or different places, and also how we pay out taxes. If we didn't have to pay taxes, it wouldn't really matter quite so much what kind of business structure we have. Or if we didn't have to worry about risk of, somebody coming after our personal wealth, then it wouldn't really matter all these. But they're basically for two things. One of them is to get ourselves organized so that we can manage our finances a little bit, also pay taxes. And the other reason is not just for organization, but also for protecting ourselves and our money and our incomes. It's a really important thing. We all probably know how important it is to protect our income. That's why we have insurance, disability insurances, so that if we can't work any longer for a particular reason, maybe a health condition or whatever, that we can maintain our income. That's really important. And so business structure and the insurance system are all there to make sure that we can continue on having an income after hardship, whatever that might look like. So back to our example. If I have my dollars that I get from my lemonade stand and I put them in my personal bank account, when it comes tax season, the government doesn't really care all that much about where your money is and how you're managing it. They just want their share of it. That's just what they're interested in. So they're just going to treat you as the first one here, which is called a sole proprietor. And a sole proprietor is kind of a fancy business term for meaning you're treated as an individual no matter where you get your money. Could come from being an employee, and it's tax season. I've just been looking at my tax records a little bit. So some of you get W-2s at the end of the year. The W-2 is how much you earn from an employer, and your money that you get from your lemonade stand. All those basically go into the same pot of money, into the same bank account or whatever. And the government says, well, we're just going to ask you to fill out one form because it's not really a complicated scenario you have here. Lemonade stands are pretty simple. However, if that guy comes along and is dissatisfied with his lemonade and says, I actually want, he's going to sue you for that portion of your company, as well as part of your individual wealth, you might say, that's a lot of liability that this lemonade stand is. And I'd rather people not be able to sue me and take my lemonade stand and my personal wealth. And I want to limit that liability. And that's what a limited liability company is. It essentially says, okay, government, I want to set up this company, but I want to limit my risk. So if somebody comes along and says, I want to take that, they can sue the company, but they can't get that extra $100 or $50 that's in your private bank account. So it's just a way to manage risk. And I'm going to talk about some of the more common setups, and depending on the kind of work people are doing. And I'll do that in a little bit here as we go along. I guess I'll start that a little bit now. If people are setting up private therapy practices, there might be a little bit more risk and a little bit more reason to protect that income. And so if that's the route people are going, oftentimes a limited liability company would be important. And you might ask the same question that I asked when I started. Why not just open up a limited liability company from the start and say, I just want to protect it at the outset? Well, it's because it's more complicated. There's more cost and more fees involved. So it might be beneficial for you, depending on what kind of work you want to do or what kind of services you want to provide, to do a sole proprietorship and not worry about the complicated nature or the more complicated nature. It's not terribly difficult, but you may not want to worry about all that extra stuff. And so maybe a sole proprietor is just the best fit. In fact, the majority of business owners in America are sole proprietors because it's simpler, taxes are easier. It's just makes life easier for you. And so, and many rehabilitation counselors are, for that matter, too. There are other business setups, partnerships, nonprofits, S Corp, C Corp. There are different kinds of businesses to set up. Those, I'm not really going to get into those as much. They're a little more complicated to set up. They're more complicated to run for sure. They come with a little bit more expense. Oftentimes people are doing those things for two reasons that I know of. One of them is to sort of manage your taxes. Excuse me, because it's one thing to pay taxes, but the way that you spend money and the way you organize it and what things you spend on also matters for how much tax you pay. So they get a little bit more complicated, and frankly, it's beyond my expertise to really even talk about those things. So I'm not going to do those. But if you do get into that scenario where you want employees, or you want to set up something that's a little bit more involved, or you want to work with another person in a partnership, I would just recommend talking to a business attorney who can help you get set up for those things. That we're going to stick to the real basics here. The other thing, the last point here on the screen is a 1099. Some of you maybe have heard of this. A 1099 person who's working under that title, it's not even really a title, but it's a tax bracket or tax form that people use. It's becoming a more common thing. So just use the Uber is the most probably well-known example that I can think of right now. If you were a taxi cab driver 10, 15 years ago, you would work for a taxi cab company and be an employee of that company, which means the company has to provide you with certain kinds of, they don't have to, but they choose to pay for some taxes. They choose to cover you in their insurance. They can provide benefits to you. And companies now are starting to say things like, well, if I don't have to pay out those benefits and I can just hire somebody as like a 1099 consultant, let's say, they technically own their own business as a sole proprietor, but we don't have to pay all those extra insurances and take on that liability. And that's what Uber drivers are. Uber drivers own their own stuff oftentimes, and they run their own company, essentially. They're just using the service of Uber to find and attract customers, essentially. So this is becoming a lot more important, and I've heard plenty of people say, well, Uber driving sounds pretty flexible, or Grubhub or Uber Eats or whatever the thing is. So isn't that a good thing? And there's a whole potentially controversial discussion in the future of the labor market of whether that is a good thing, particularly people with disabilities. And part of it has to do with, if you're your own boss, you can set your own work times and you can set your own accommodations if you need them. But it does come with limitations too. And we're not going to really get into that discussion today. But I wanted to put that here in this section, even though it's not technically a business structure, it is a thing that people are exploring and looking into. So the reason it's here is because I want to talk about the steps to developing what a self-employment opportunity for you, and as the title suggests, for your clients as well. So is that a good scenario? Becoming a sole proprietor, working for somebody else? Who are your referral sources? Where is the money going to come from? And how do you protect yourself? And all kinds of questions like that. That's what we're going to get into here. This screen is just an overview of what we're going to dive into a little bit more in depth in the coming slides. So let's just do a little overview here real quick to talk about what this looks like. Number one, we're just brainstorming. We're coming up with ideas. I'm going to share with you towards the end of this some of the ideas. Daniel mentioned that I recently wrote a book about career opportunities in the private sector of rehabilitation counseling. I'll share with you some of those and kind of talk about a few of them as we go here, just for sake of example. But it's not everything that counselors can do. And because of my example of Uber and other things, the world is changing and there's other opportunities to support people with disabilities, some of which, if you're, say, a person who's coming out of school, you might find an employer in your area who can pay you to do those services. Others of you might say, but I identify a need now and there's no employers in my community and I want to serve those people and make a living doing it. And so you might do some of this brainstorming and coming up with those kind of ideas. And so that's kind of step one. We'll dig into that in a second. The second thing is that not all of our ideas are good ones. I tell my friends and people around me that I love to come up with 10 different ideas. 9 of them are terrible. Well, say 8 of them are terrible. 1 of them won't work. And maybe 1 of them I'll pursue a little bit more in the future. But at some point I have to decide, is this a realistic kind of thing? And number 2 says business feasibility. I have to look more in depth at who else might be providing this? Who could pay me to do that kind of stuff? Where's the money going to come from? Who are the clients? And just a lot more detail around that. And as I pare down my idea from dream big and don't care if it's realistic to let's actually think about whether it's realistic, to actually writing it down on paper, we're just sort of, this whole process is planning it all out and making sure we have a good solid idea. And so writing a business plan is just part of that process of making sure I have a good solid idea before I start either investing money into it or taking steps to pursue this, or well, I guess those are two good things to plan out before you do. Number 4 is launching the business. We'll talk about that in more detail in a second. And then maintaining what that looks like for you. It's one thing to start a business. It's another thing to make it successful over time. I think it's something like, I think I've heard the term like 50% of businesses fail after started, something like that. So that's why we want to put a little bit of time up front to make sure we think about all the things that could happen, or we have a good plan essentially. So as we're dreaming big, as we're thinking about the kinds of work that we could do, one of the things to consider is, what is your education? And I put in parentheses here, what is your scope of practice? As rehabilitation counselors, there are things that we can do that make us unique that not really many other people can do, or arguably nobody else can do. We know about disability and career and counseling, and those unique things are different than somebody who's doing just mental health counseling, or somebody who works in human resources, or a career counselor at a high school or something like that. We have a unique niche that we can fill. But that means there's also things that we aren't trained for. One of the common debates that I hear now in the educational world is whether rehabilitation counselors can diagnose, and are they counselors that can do that kind of mental health therapy? And we're not going to get into the discussion about that, but there are states that have laws that say yes, you can, or no, you can't. There are professional debates on depends on your training and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things we want to think about as we're saying, can I do this work, is, am I trained for it? Am I ready to do that? I'll leave 2 caveats here. One of them is that you probably can do more than you think, and you probably should be careful about not doing too much. And I realize those are kind of contradictory, but as I've heard people talk about what your education prepares you for, I've heard people who it's kind of on a spectrum, like you can do so much more than you think you are, or think you can. And others who say, be really careful, because you want to manage your level of risk. And when you're thinking about self-employment, there may be a little bit more that you're taking on the responsibility for than if you were, say, hired by somebody and sort of pushing the boundaries of what you're capable of. But that's another discussion altogether. Consider your specialties. This goes along with training, but what differentiates you from others? If you have a community and there are it's full of social workers and human resource departments and employers and counselors and all kinds of people around, what makes you unique? We're going to get into talking a little bit about marketing here in just a little bit, but something that can help you be successful is that you can provide something that somebody else can't. And I think if you live in this century and you are familiar with like tech gadgets, there's always people trying to add a new camera to give them a new edge on the phone market or something like that. That's the principle here, is if somebody is not getting a certain kind of service in your community and you can provide that, that's a different service than what's available. And so it's just, how are you special and different from other folks? Another big one that we get to think about here, but we don't have to think too much about it. We're going to whittle this down as we go, but what is the funding source? The rehab community for a long time has been funded by the federal government. In the private world, it's sometimes funded by insurances, sometimes by the legal process or attorneys, which ultimately comes from the clients too. But there are different ways to get money. Grants is another one. Insurance, if you're doing a mental health practice serving, just for example, parents with children with disabilities or whatever, you might be able to take insurances if you can bill for mental health diagnoses or something like that. So where the money comes from has a lot to do with, is there enough money that could potentially come into me to support an actual business venture? Is it a full-time thing that I could do? Or would it be just, I'm mostly an employee, but I do a few hours on the side as a consultant or something like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Who are your clients and customers? this kind of adds more to what makes you different and unique. But are you going to be serving all people with disabilities? Is it just people with certain kinds of disabilities? If you know your referral source is maybe like a traumatic brain injury rehabilitation center, and that's primarily where your customers or clients are going to come from, that can kind of depend on how you set yourself up. Another one, number 5 here, is can I afford the time it will take to stabilize? And what I mean by that is, if I'm an employee now and I'm working for somebody else and I'm going to go out on my own venture and say, I'm just going to start my own business. If you just leave your job and decide to exit, it might take a month, 6 months, a year to build up enough clientele for you to self-support yourself. So what I mean by stabilize is making sure that you have an income that's able to pay for your life while you're changing your careers or getting out of school or something like that. So the timeline is really what I'm getting at here. I'm also just looking at the time, and I'm going to speed up through it a little bit. So if it feels like I'm going fast, feel free to leave your questions in the chat, and I'll try to either answer them as we go, or we'll leave time at the end to answer some questions too if you have them. I already mentioned that it doesn't have this down at the bottom here. We don't have to be very specific or realistic. This is where we're just kind of brainstorming. And the last point here is use other people, talk to other people, throw your ideas out to people that you trust, and see if you can use them as a sounding board to help you determine whether these are even realistic. Just as an example, I was talking to my dad the other day. My dad's he was formerly a weightlifter, and he is training his grandkids, my nephews, to be weightlifters, because my sister homeschools, and he said, I'm going to train them to do this. And then some other charter school or co-op or whatever said, hey, you're doing kind of like a gym class. We don't have a gym class. Can you come do it for us? And so he's like, maybe I could just drive a van around with all my weights and have like a mobile gym or something like that. And so we were going through this process, and I was like, Dad, that's a terrible idea. Actually, it was an awesome idea. I think it sounds really fun, but it's expensive, and whether he would be able to, they would be able to pay him enough to do that. That's sort of us using each other as a sounding board, but he's kind of dreaming big and coming up with these ideas. And that's an example of what we're talking about here. So business feasibility, are we even being realistic? So here's a couple things to think about as we're determining whether a business idea would work for us. One of them is the geographical reach of our clients. Some of us might be thinking, I live in a big city and I'd like to provide services to the people within my city. Others of us, depending on maybe where our funding source comes from, what kind of transportation availability we have, we might think, well, I could probably drive within my county or within a couple counties, or maybe even within my state. But few of us would be willing to drive across country to go, if I found a client in California and I live in New York, I'm probably not going to be able to provide those services on the ground. So we have to think about what's our geographical reach. This does get a little bit more interesting, fun, potentially complicated when we're thinking about services online, which is a part of our world now. What is our reach of clients, and what are we available to do? It might be nationwide, it might be even worldwide, depending on what you're providing. So something to consider. Another one is competition. And I think you guys probably all know what competition means, but I'll just say this specific to the rehab world. I see very, very little people talking about competitors in the rehab world. It's out there, there are some, but there's generally so much work to do that it's kind of rare to worry too much about competitors. Most of us are generally really supportive. And in my experience, as I started to look into the world of private rehab and see, what other kind of businesses people were running, most everybody was really good about saying, I just want to tell you how this works because I'm overwhelmed and I think there's more work to be done here. And so there are lots of people who are willing to, I shouldn't say lots, there are people who are willing to mentor you and support you through the process. All you got to do is ask. And by the way, I'm going to kind of back up to the beginning here for just a second. The best way to go about setting something up like this is all sort of general planning stuff that if you didn't know it before, you can use this to help you think about it. But the best way to go about any of this, if you're thinking about starting something up is find somebody who's done it before and just ask them what they did and what works in your area and how things happen. That's essentially what I did and why I wrote the book and why I'm teaching and talking to people about these things, because I asked and people were so good about telling me, this is how I did it, this is how it works, and here's what you should think about as you're going into it. So with that said, the last thing that you can think about in terms of business feasibility is assessment of community need. Does my community really want this? So to use my dad's mobile gym example, does the community actually want a mobile gym? Because if they don't, he's not going to be able to find people to pay him to do this, and he's going to have a gym full of dumbbells or barbells or whatever you call them. I'm obviously not a weightlifter. You can't see my arms, but it's pretty evident if you see me. So does the community actually want this? And that's part of the question of, is this going to be successful in the future if I hang up my own shingle and decide to offer this service? So another thing to think about. As we get a little bit more realistic with our future plans, one of the things you'll hear people talk about is a business plan. And what we have here are essentially 8 different sections or elements of a business plan that you can think to fill out. Just because of time, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. But there are resources that I'll give you at the end if you're like, I know I've heard of a business plan before, but I have no idea how to write one. So I'll talk about them briefly, but then I'll give you some more resources. Executive summary is just kind of like a general overview. It's kind of like your introduction paragraph in a school paper or something. A company summary has to do with, who is the company? Is it just you? What is your business structure, like we talked about earlier? Where is it going to be housed? Are you doing this out of your home? Are you going to have a designated space where, like a storefront kind of thing? Is it going to be an online business? It's just explaining the details of what it looks like. The product or services, probably pretty self-explanatory, but this is one of the areas where I find it's helpful to write these things down, because you might have an idea and then you might realize that actually this is sort of 2 different services that I'm going to provide. One is placement support, and another one is maybe, I don't know, like resume building or something like that. And I want to differentiate those so I can have people pay at different rates or something like that. But it really helps you break down, like, how much am I going to charge for different things? Because they might not be the same costs. In some cases, you might say, like, for example, if I'm interested in working for the Social Security Administration as an expert witness doing testimony, you don't really have the option of offering different services. They're just going to pay you per case. And so the service that you provide is expert testimony, and that's really it. It kind of simplifies things. If you're providing career counseling, you might charge a little bit different for interview preparation versus, I don't know, like resume review, something like that. Market research, we talked about that a little bit earlier when we talked about geography and competition. And basically that's the idea, is like, what's going on in your community? Is there opportunity for this? A marketing plan is a big one. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in upcoming slides as well, but marketing is like how you tell people about your, and I'll use our example from earlier, lemonade stand. Is marketing just putting up a sign on my street corner? Is it business cards? Is it flyers? Flyers used to be a big thing in the old days where you put them up on bulletin boards. Or do you put up Facebook ads? Or if people that you want to attract are not all of your Facebook friends and family, are you putting up, are you going to conferences? Are you doing lunch and learns with people in the community? Like maybe it's attorneys if you're getting into the work comp space, something like that. So how are you going to get in front of the people who could potentially be your referral source? As I said earlier, if you're doing Social Security vocational expert witness, that's a mouthful. If you're doing that kind of work, you don't really need a marketing plan. You're essentially being vetted for having the right kind of qualifications by the SSA. And if you have those, they just send you cases. You don't have to convince them that you're qualified because you already have been determined to be so. Number 6 is operations plan. What does day-to-day work look like and how are you going to keep things running? We'll talk about maintenance in a second. Management, a little bit of the same thing. If you're managing yourself, do you have time to both see clients, handle your finances, send out invoices if that's something you're doing, pay your taxes? You have to have time for all of those different tasks Some of that stuff is the stuff I don't think all of us think about at the beginning, but if we use the business plan to sort of establish what our process is going to be, that can be really helpful upfront. And then financial plan. We have to pay for things, and most of us are not going to be in the scenario where you have to get upfront or startup capital, is the technical term for it. We're not going to have to, get $30,000 to pay for furniture and a sign to put up in a storefront. Most of us are going to be in the rehab world, start with, getting forms, paying for software, making sure that we can pay an attorney to overlook our documentation, that kind of stuff. So some of that financial means might come from friends and family. It might come from our own savings. It's just generally not quite as much money upfront for most of us. But of course, there's always people who will think big, do different things. Launching the business, I'm going to speed up again, even just a little bit more here. Obtaining licenses, insurances. Most of us are familiar, if we're students or in the practices right now, that we have to have things like liability insurance. Maybe we're insuring the stuff that we have with us, our assessment instruments, maybe a vehicle, something like that. Those things are really important, worth thinking about. Opening up a bank account. So one of the things to help you get set up, and one of the things I keep hearing over and over from people doing different kinds of businesses, is make sure you separate your money. If you're an employee and you're kind of thinking maybe 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week, I'm going to do this other thing on the side, just get a separate bank account. It can be a free checking account, doesn't have to be anything fancy, but make sure you're keeping those money streams separate. Like our lemonade stand example, if you put your $1 with the $100 in your personal bank account, that kind of stuff can get really confusing when you're trying to figure out which money came from where, and especially when it comes to tax time. So just open up a separate bank account. Purchasing inventory and equipment. I think that one's probably pretty self-explanatory. Start marketing activities. There's a lot to be said about here, and I think I'll kind of just breeze over this one for now. But whatever you determine those marketing activities are, which can get kind of confusing and complicated, this is where you can start doing those. And you might even start doing them as you're getting things set up. But generally speaking, it's helpful to have it all written down, have a good plan. So when you're going out and telling people about what kind of things you want to do, what kind of services you're providing to people with disabilities, you can be really clear about what you do and what you don't do, so that other people don't mistake and get confused. Because if you can't be really clear about what you have to offer, you may have a harder time attracting clients. And then make and sell products. Most of us aren't going to be selling products, but you'll provide those services. The last part is deliver to customers, is just doing the actual work. I include monitoring inventory here because that comes from when I said earlier that I got most of this content from those course modules about helping your clients set up their own businesses. They might have, run a coffee stand or, sell screen print t-shirts online. So inventory is more of a thing for people who sell products. In rehabilitation counseling, there's not a lot of inventory that we are probably going to be using. Continuing to market. And the only thing I'll say extra that I haven't said about marketing is that I don't look at marketing as attracting customers, especially in this counseling world. It's not about attracting customers and, bringing in more money. It's about networking and knowing people and being able to be clear about what people need in your community and how those needs can be met. And if you express, kind of here's the problem and here's how it can be met, and you're the person that can do it, people start to build trust in you. And your integrity as a business person is not so much about, how all this talk about money. It's about how good you are at doing your work. So if you're working with integrity and doing a really good job, that's your marketing plan right there. And most people say they don't really do a lot, at least from my experience in the private world, they don't do a lot of marketing after they get their name established. They just let their reputation do the work. So monitoring finances, filing quarterly or annual taxes. If you're a sole proprietor, you're going to be filing them annually because that's what we do normally. And you're not a sort of separate business entity. For other business structures, you may have to do that differently, which gets a little more complicated. And then reviewing business licensure. Finally, I've talked a little bit about marketing. I'm going to skip over this sort of generally, but there's a lot of ways to market. And with more online presence, this is becoming more of a thing. I just mentioned about work with integrity, share your name. Your brand is essentially your name. Unless you run a company with a separate business name, oftentimes people know the work of Aaron as myself, which is why I have always had sole proprietorships. And I use my name as my brand, essentially saying, if you like me and my work, then that's the business, that's the service you're paying for, is what I can provide. There's a note here in the bottom. I'll just explain what that is. There's a lot of debate earlier when I said in the beginning about what is your scope of practice? What can you do and what can't you do? There's a good, healthy discussion, we'll say, a lot of debate and some strong feelings about what counseling is and what coaching is or consulting, and what kinds of activities you can do as a counselor and what you can't do as a counselor, and what things people do as coaches, which feels a little bit like counseling, but it's, maybe sort of part of the counseling territory. We're not going to get into that a whole bunch, but there's a discussion there to be had, and feel free to ask questions if you'd like to. Here are a list of resources. These resources are basically places you can go for help. I'm not going to talk in detail about them because I'm realizing we need to stop and offer time for questions. But if you have a disability, there might be support for you to help set up a company, or there might even be money available. I'm not even sure about that. But if there's money available to help you get started or help you have a support person to think through this process, think about your business plan, think about, is it feasible? Think about all the things that you maybe can't think about because you don't know to ask them. Some of these places might be good for that. Number 2 here on this list is local small business development centers. Most communities have them, most communities of size anyway. I went to one guy and I told him I was a rehabilitation counselor, and probably like many of you, when you tell people you're rehabilitation counselors, he goes, I don't know what that is. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I explained, well, I'm actually looking at seeing clients with disabilities to help with things like finding work or managing benefits, or, I gave him a list, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I help people start construction companies. So what he was able to provide, though, was a template for a business plan. Excuse me, a template for a business plan and some resources for how to kind of get set up to pay taxes. And those were all things I had no idea what to do about that. So he was really helpful for that. So some of these might be helpful for you, especially depending on your, if you have a minority status, if you're a veteran or whatever. There's different resources, and that's what these are. Again, I'll reiterate number 5 here. Find others who do work that you're trying to do and just ask them questions. This is, it's not something you have to start from scratch all the time. You can learn a lot from other people who have either made mistakes and don't want you to make the same ones, or can just tell you things about what works and what doesn't. That's really the moral of the story there. What you see on the screen now is comes from the book that I wrote, although what I tried to do in that work was collect as much as I possibly could, both employment options, but also things you can do as a rehab counselor without, as a self-employed person. So I've kind of pulled those out, and these are just titles. I'm not going to go through all of them. I've talked about some of them. Social Security expert witness work, consulting things, working as a transition counselor. I've heard of people doing that outside of state pre-ETS kind of work. In the center column, there are life care planners. I talked to somebody who she'd been in a certain community and people kind of knew her, and she found out that there were plenty of people with disabilities in the foster care system, and she was providing support to parents who were taking on foster kids who had disabilities with unique needs, and they had no idea how to do that. And so she kind of helped with them and did some consulting stuff, or, counseling, coaching. I don't know what she called it, but that's just an example of one of those opportunities that, there are people out there who could use your expertise. By the way, something I forgot to mention at the very beginning. Last year, I listened to a podcast, or it wasn't that long ago, but CRCC, most of you are familiar with what that is. CRCC, who certifies rehabilitation counselors, they do a podcast. And there was a guy on there named Dr. James McNeil, excuse me. And he said something that has been resonating in my ears for quite a while, and I keep telling it to anybody who's willing to listen to me. Basically, he said, wherever people with disabilities are, that's where rehabilitation counselors need to be. And it kind of captures the spirit of that. There's help that's needed out there, and we have the expertise. Part of the reason why I get kind of interested in this setting up your own business stuff is because we just need to get together with those people and figure out how to make it sustainable for us to earn our living and for them to get the help that they need. And this is a perfect example of that, working in the foster care system for those with those parents. And so just an example. I'll leave the rest of them on the screen here. Feel free to ask about them if you'd like to. And this is the last slide. So when I gave a kind of similar presentation to a group of state VR counselors before, and one of the things that we had talked about is, what if we're going to provide self-employment services to clients, what kind of things might they do? And I included here for those of you that might be interested in that kind of thing, because it's one thing to set up your business for yourself, and it's another thing to set it up for somebody else. They might just do different kinds of activities. I also mentioned at the very beginning that the world is changing and there's a lot more online opportunities to make money. Most of us are some of us are familiar with Etsy, I shouldn't assume. If people are crafty and they're building things or making things, selling on Etsy is an option for business. I'm not going to go through all of these. Social media, I keep doing this because I'm used to having things posted behind me. So if you see me waving my arms, that's what that's about. Being a social media creator, I'm sure all of us have feelings about who's going to be an influencer and who isn't. It's not necessarily a realistic idea. But I'm sure many of us have worked with clients or people who say like, yeah, I want to play Minecraft and be a Twitch streamer. And they think they can make money. And some people do, but of course not everybody does. So these aren't necessarily all feasible, but they are options. Selling on Amazon, selling on Fiverr, Upwork. If you want to do transcription work at home, Scribey, there's a whole bunch of different opportunities for people to earn money on the internet. And essentially the clientele would be worldwide. Your referral sources can be worldwide. In fact, and then I'll leave the rest of it up here. You can just look on the screen to sort of see the other employment options. This is the last slide. I'm going to say thank you in a second, but this is a picture of my book. I actually hired a guy from Spain to do the cover art, and a guy from to make a logo for me. I think he was from the Middle East somewhere. I don't even remember where he was from. But the interesting and important thing is that I'm paying for people's services all across the globe. And I think there are opportunities for us as rehabilitation counselors to think about how can we provide our specialty services for both people within our cities, our counties, our states, our country, and potentially even globally, depending on how we want to think about what our expertise is. So my email address is here. My website, if you're interested in kind of getting more of this, some of this stuff is in the book, some of it's not. I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to share information. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. It's been fun for me to talk about it, and I'm happy to answer any questions if we have them.
And thank you so much for just such a rich presentation with lots of wonderful information.
You're welcome.
So we do have a question that came in for you, and that was, how would you go about getting federal funding for a sole proprietorship or LLC? Is that something that's possible?
So how do you get federal funding for a sole proprietor? The funding isn't going to pay for your company necessarily. You don't actually have to pay to start the company. From my original lemonade stand example, as long as I find a customer, then I have a company and it's just set up as a sole proprietor. This is where things get a little bit confusing for us who haven't lived in this world. I was an English major. So when I started doing this stuff a while ago, I had no idea. The federal funding, it depends on what program you're thinking about. So here's an example of how you might do this and how we can think about it a little bit differently. So one of the things the Social Security program does, Social Security is a federal program, and they provide benefits for people with disabilities. Most of us are familiar with that. One of the programs to help people who are on Social Security funding is how you can help people get off and gain more independence in their life. So some of us are familiar with the Ticket to Work program. The Ticket to Work is essentially how do we get people employment? And some of us are familiar with that cliff of like, I don't want to take on more hours than I can handle or have more so much income that my benefits stop. And so the Ticket to Work program essentially is how you can get people to more independence, more employment, so they won't need their benefits. That's the whole point of it. So the funding comes from the government paying for people through the Ticket to Work program to become what they call employment networks. An employment network is just a rehabilitation counselor who helps people get back to work and manage that really stressful spot of, can I get off these benefits and am I stable enough in my job to do that? So if I were to say, here's my business idea, I want to be an employment network and my funding source is the Social Security Administration through this channel of Ticket to Work funding, they're not paying for my business, they're paying for my services. So you can essentially start the business. It's a little complicated, there's some paperwork involved, but you can start the business and they won't pay for you to kind of get things up and running, but they'll pay for your services, which can then help you do your work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I'll add one thing to that. So it sounds kind of like the question was a little bit about like, how do I get set up and how do I get started and where does that money come from? The majority of people start really small, and they'll use their own funds. Just as an example, when I I did a little bit of consulting with the VA, and they were paying me while I was in school to do some assessments for veterans. And the rehab counselors in the VA were so busy that they couldn't get out of their offices to go drive to this veteran's home and do this assessment. So they said, hey, Aaron, can you help, essentially? And so I said, yep, I'll do it. So I'd drive to their house and then I'd come back. All I needed was a car and a computer and essentially a few forms that said, here's an invoice that I can send them to sort of do the billing. So I found it free on the internet, so there wasn't anything to pay for there. I had to start get myself organized and set up some Excel spreadsheets to make sure I was tracking the money that was coming in and what cases I was working on and all that stuff. So that was essentially free. And it was a way that I could start small. I eventually paid for some people to help me do some different things, but I started really small and I didn't have to use a lot of money. And the money that I did use came out of my own personal finances. And so whether people have that kind of money to start up, that's kind of, you may have to beg your rich uncles for that kind of funding. With the employment network example, there are training programs that can train you to learn about the benefit systems and about the programs to get you started, just like you paid for school. So sometimes you might need to come up with $1,000 for a training program to get qualified to be able to do that work. But the money doesn't come from the government there. It comes from your own finances or people around you that can help support that. That's how you get started. And then the income comes from providing services. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. That also kind of taps into another question that came in about, resources and recommendations for acquiring federal funding for a new business. So thanks for addressing that. I know we do have another question that came in though, that says, I'm a deaf rehab counseling student hoping to go into private practice in the future. One of the things that is important to me is having inclusive policies to support my clients with various challenges. Where would be the best place to get more information about that?
Oh, that's I don't even know. I'll give you some general rules of thumb because I can't really tell you exactly the best place. Rule of thumb is talk to other counselors who are maybe providing similar services, talk to interpreters. There are government programs that are essentially are there to support people who are with deaf and hard of hearing conditions. And I mean, a lot of online research and just asking around. I mean, because I don't have that expertise, it's hard for me to give you anything really substantial to help you. But people are your best resource. And so, calling around, asking, internet research, all of those things can help you find ways of getting started. And I mentioned this earlier, kind of alluded to it, but when it comes to getting started and providing forms and setting up policies, I've found people to be really generous with their time and what they've started to sort of pass on the legacy, because most of us want to see people do well in life, not protect our own stuff that we built and keep it away from everybody else. So hopefully that helps. I'm sorry I can't give you more.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And we do have some feedback as well. I know Vicky had shared some great resources and recommendations in the chat box as well. And then just overall, a lot of positive feedback and praise, Aaron, just for all the great wealth of knowledge that you've shared. And so we do have on the screen, Aaron, it looks like you've shared your email address. So would that be okay for people to contact you with any follow-up questions if they may have?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you. Um, so at this time, we would like to provide just our sincerest gratitude to Dr. Aaron Mertes for this wonderful and meaningful presentation on the basics of setting up a private practice for you or your clients. Dr. Mertes, we are most grateful for you for taking the time to share with us today and share your knowledge and expertise and wisdom. And of course, thank you so much, Ruth, for your services today as well. For those in attendance, we appreciate you joining us today, and we would like to invite you to save the date for our next ARCA webinar, scheduled for Friday, March 1st, 2024 at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Blind Spots, an overview of blindness and low vision and implications in counseling practice. A registration link for the next webinar can be found in the chat box. We hope that you will consider joining us. And on behalf of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association, or ARCA, we thank you all again, and we wish each of you a wonderful weekend ahead. And thank you, Dr. Mertes, again.
Yeah,